The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in September of 1878, and Grace Lawson nearly threw it away with the rest of the advertisements that cluttered the boarding house's mail table. She had seen a dozen such notices in her 3 weeks searching for employment in Vulture City, Arizona Territory, each one promising respectable work that turned out to be anything but. Still, something made her break the seal and unfold the cream-colored paper, and as she read the neat, masculine handwriting, her heart began to beat faster. Seeking educated woman to provide instruction for 2 children, ages 7 and 9. Room and board provided. Wages negotiable. Must be willing to relocate to ranch 15 miles south of Vulture City. References required. Inquire at Grayson Anderson, Anderson Ranch. Grace read it 3 times before allowing herself to feel the first flutter of hope. A teaching position. A real teaching position. She had come west from Philadelphia after her father's death, 6 months earlier, carrying little more than her clothes, her books, and a burning need to escape the pitying looks of people who had known her all her life. The money her father left barely covered his funeral expenses, and her mother's relatives made it clear they considered Grace, at 23 and unmarried, a burden they had no intention to shoulder. So she had taken what little remained and bought a ticket west, drawn by newspaper advertisements promising opportunity and new beginnings. The reality of Vulture City had been considerably harsher than the promises. The mining town was rough, dusty, and filled with men who looked at a woman alone with either suspicion or something far worse. The boarding house where she had taken a room was respectable enough, run by a stern widow named Mrs. Patterson, but Grace's funds were nearly depleted. She had perhaps 2 weeks left before she would be destitute. She smoothed the letter against her skirt and made her decision. Within the hour, she had borrowed writing materials from Mrs. Patterson and composed a response, carefully listing her qualifications. 4 years teaching at a girls' academy in Philadelphia. Proficiency in reading, writing, arithmetic, geography, history, and basic science. She mentioned her late father had been a schoolmaster, that she had been raised among books and learning. She did not mention her desperation or her dwindling funds. The reply came faster than she expected. 2 days later, a ranch hand appeared at the boarding house with a note requesting she meet Mr. Anderson at the Vulture City General Store the following morning at 10 o'clock. He would be the tall man in the brown hat, the note said, and he would appreciate if she could bring any references or certificates she possessed. Grace spent that evening pressing her best dress, a modest gray cotton with black piping that she hoped struck the right balance between professional and practical. She polished her boots until they shone and pinned her honey-colored hair into the most severe bun she could manage. When she looked at herself in the small mirror above her washstand, she saw a woman trying very hard to appear older and more experienced than her years suggested. Sleep eluded her that night. She lay in the narrow bed, listening to the sounds of Vulture City settling into its restless evening rhythm, the distant piano music from the saloons, the occasional shout or burst of laughter, the creaking of the boarding house's old bones. She thought about Philadelphia, about the comfortable certainty of her old life, and wondered for the 100th time if she had made a terrible mistake coming west. But then she remembered the alternative becoming a charity case in her cousin's household, forever grateful, forever reminded of her dependents, and she knew she had made the only choice she could. The general store smelled of coffee, leather, and the sharp tang of pickle brine when Grace entered the next morning. She had arrived 15 minutes early, her references clutched in a leather portfolio that had been her father's. The proprietor, A balding man with spectacles perched on his nose, nodded at her and returned to his inventory, leaving her to wait near the front window where she could watch the street. At precisely 10 o'clock, a man dismounted from a large bay horse and tied it to the hitching post outside. Grace knew immediately it was Grayson Anderson. He stood well over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered and lean in the way of men who worked hard for their living. His brown hat was pushed back slightly, revealing dark hair touched with gray at the temples. As he stepped into the store, Grace estimated his age at somewhere in his mid-30s, perhaps 35 or 36. His face was weathered by sun and wind, with strong features that stopped just short of handsome a straight nose, a firm jaw shadowed with stubble, and eyes of such a startling clear gray they seemed almost silver in the morning light. Those eyes found Grace immediately, and something passed across his expression: surprise, perhaps, or assessment before he crossed the store in 4 long strides. "Miss Lawson." His voice was deep and measured, with the faint remnants of what might have been a southern accent worn smooth by years. "Mr. Anderson." Grace extended her hand, and he shook it with a grip that was firm but careful, as though he was aware of his own strength. His palm was calloused, his fingers long and capable. "I appreciate you meeting me here," he said, releasing her hand and gesturing toward a corner of the store where a few chairs sat near the pot-bellied stove. "I thought it might be more proper than asking you to ride out to the ranch without knowing anything about the position." They sat, and Grace found herself being studied with an intensity that made her want to fidget. She forced herself to remain still, to meet his gaze with what she hoped was professional confidence. "You are younger than I expected," Grayson said finally, and Grace felt her stomach sink. "I assure you, Mr. Anderson, my age does not reflect on my qualifications." She opened the portfolio and handed him the papers inside her certificate from the teacher's college, letters of reference from the academy's headmistress, a letter from her father's colleague attesting to her character and education. Grayson read through them carefully, his brow furrowed in concentration. When he looked up, some of the wariness had left his expression. "These are impressive," he said. "You were teaching at the Woodbridge Academy for Girls." "Yes, for 4 years." "And you left because—" Grace had prepared for this question. "My father passed away. He was my only remaining family in Philadelphia. I wanted a fresh start somewhere new." It was not quite the whole truth, but it was not quite a lie either. Grayson studied her for a long moment, and Grace had the uncomfortable feeling he could see through the careful omission. "I will be honest with you, Miss Lawson. My situation is not standard." He set the papers aside and leaned back in his chair. "My wife died 2 years ago. Fever. My daughter Sarah is 9, and my son Thomas is 7. For the past 2 years, they have had no formal education beyond what I could teach them in the evenings, and I am the first to admit my own schooling was limited. They can read and write at a basic level, but they need more than I can give them." Grace's initial impression softened. A widower trying to do right by his children was vastly different from what she had feared: some rough bachelor looking for a housekeeper under the guise of education. "I am sorry for your loss," she said, and meant it. Something flickered in those gray eyes: pain, perhaps, or just the practiced control of a man who had learned not to show his grief to strangers. "The ranch is a full day's ride from town," he continued. "We run cattle, and I have 5 hands who work for me. They bunk in a separate building, and I keep strict rules about respect and proper behavior. My house has 4 bedrooms. You would have your own room, and I would expect you to take your meals with the family. The children need consistency and structure." "What would you expect in terms of curriculum?" Grace asked. "Reading, writing, arithmetic, certainly. Whatever else you think they need to know." My daughter is bright and hungry for learning. My son is more inclined toward being outdoors, but he needs his education too." Grayson paused, then added, "I would also appreciate if you could help Sarah with the things a woman should know. Her mother's death left her without that guidance." Grace nodded slowly, considering. It was more than she had hoped for: room and board, meaningful work, children who needed her. The isolation concerned her slightly, but after the overwhelming chaos of Vulture City, the prospect of quiet and purpose was appealing. "What wages are you offering?" she asked, forcing herself to be practical. $30 a month, plus room and board. It was more than generous. Grace had made $25 a month at the academy, and that had not included housing. "When would you need me to start?" "As soon as you are able. If you are agreeable, you could ride out with me today. I brought a wagon, thinking you might have luggage." Grace felt the decision crystallizing in her chest. This was what she had come west for: not just escape, but purpose. A chance to be needed, to be useful, to build something new. "I would need to collect my things from the boarding house and settle my account with the proprietress," she said. For the first time, Grayson Anderson smiled, and the transformation was remarkable. The stern, weathered face became almost boyish, and Grace felt an unexpected flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with professional prospects. "Then we have an agreement, Miss Lawson." "We do, Mr. Anderson." They shook hands again, and this time Grace noticed the warmth of his palm, the way his fingers lingered just a fraction too long before releasing hers. When she met his eyes, she saw he was watching her with an expression she could not quite read: something between relief and caution, hope and wariness. Within 2 hours, Grace had packed her 2 trunks, paid Mrs. Patterson, and found herself sitting beside Grayson Anderson on a wagon seat, bouncing along the rough road that led south from Vulture City. The September sun was warm but not oppressive, and the desert landscape spread around them in shades of tan and gold, punctuated by the dark green of mesquite and the occasional saguaro cactus standing like sentinels against the blue sky. They rode in silence for the first hour, and Grace used the time to observe her new employer. He handled the horses with easy competence, his large hands gentle on the reins. He sat relaxed but alert, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon with the automatic wariness of a man who had learned to watch for danger. Once, he pointed out a group of pronghorn antelope in the distance, and Grace saw the way his face softened with appreciation for their grace. "Tell me about your children," Grace said finally, unable to bear the silence any longer. Grayson glanced at her, then back at the road. "Sarah is serious, like her mother was. She reads anything she can get her hands on, which is not much out here. She mothers her brother something fierce, sometimes too much. She took her mother's death hard and decided she needed to step into that role. And Thomas is all boy. He would rather be working with the horses or following the hands around than sitting still. But he is sweet-natured and eager to please." Grayson's voice warmed as he spoke of his son. "He misses his mother, but he was younger when she passed. The memories are fading for him in a way they have not for Sarah. How did you manage after your wife died?" Grace asked, then immediately worried she had been too forward, but Grayson did not seem to take offense. "Badly at first. I hired a woman from town to come stay and help with the children, but she lasted 6 months before the isolation drove her back to Vulture City. After that, I tried to manage on my own. The hands helped where they could, and Sarah tried to do more than any 9-year-old should have to do. It was not fair to either of them, but I did not know what else to do. It cannot have been easy for you either." Grayson was quiet for so long Grace thought he would not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough. "I loved my wife, Miss Lawson. Margaret was a good woman, a good mother. When she died, I felt like I had failed to protect what mattered most. Watching my children struggle without her has been harder than anything I have ever endured. That is why I need you. Sarah needs a woman's influence, and Thomas needs someone who can be patient with his restlessness. I can give them a home and put food on the table, but I cannot give them what you can. The raw honesty in his words touched something in Grace's chest. She looked at his profile, the strong jaw, the lines around his eyes that spoke of worry and grief, and felt a surge of determination. This family needed her, truly needed her, and that was worth more than wages or security. I will do my very best for them, she promised. Grayson turned to look at her fully, and the intensity in his gray eyes made her breath catch. I believe you will. The ranch appeared in the late afternoon, nestled in a valley where a creek ran year-round. The main house was larger than Grace had expected, built of adobe with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. There were several outbuildings, a barn, a bunkhouse, a smokehouse, and what looked like a workshop. Corrals held horses and cattle, and the whole operation had an air of competence and care that spoke well of Grayson's management. As the wagon rattled into the yard, 2 children burst from the house, followed by a gray-haired woman wiping her hands on an apron. The children stopped short when they saw Grace, sudden shyness overtaking their excitement. "Sarah, Thomas, come meet Miss Lawson," Grayson called, setting the brake and climbing down from the wagon. He walked around to Grace's side and offered his hand to help her down. His grip was steady and strong, and Grace was conscious of the way his hand spanned her waist as he guided her to the ground. The girl, Sarah, was tall for 9, with her father's dark hair and gray eyes. She stood very straight, her hands clasped in front of her, studying Grace with solemn intensity. Thomas was smaller, stockier, with lighter brown hair and his mother's blue eyes, according to what Grayson had mentioned earlier. He fidgeted under his sister's restraining hand on his shoulder. "Children, this is Miss Lawson. She is going to be your teacher and will be living with us from now on." Grayson's voice was gentle but firm. "How do you do, Miss Lawson?" Sarah said, dropping into a perfect curtsy that made Grace's heart ache. The child was trying so hard to be grown up. "I am very well, Sarah, and you must be Thomas." Grace smiled at the boy, who gave her a gap-toothed grin in return. "Are you really going to teach us?" Thomas asked, his earlier shyness forgotten. "Papa said you were a real teacher from back east. Do you know about Indians and gold mines?" "And rattlesnakes, Thomas," Sarah hissed, mortified, but Grace laughed. "I know some things about those subjects, but I suspect I will learn quite a lot from you as well. I have only been in Arizona territory for a few weeks." "Mrs. Chen, this is Miss Lawson," Grayson said, addressing the older woman who had approached more slowly. "Miss Lawson, Mrs. Chen has been kind enough to come help prepare the house and make sure we had a proper meal for your arrival." Mrs. Chen was Chinese, her iron gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, her face weathered but kind. She gave Grace a quick, assessing look and must have liked what she saw because she nodded approvingly. "You look sensible," she said in accented English. "These children need sensible. You need help, you send word to town. I come." She fixed Grayson with a stern look. "You make sure she has everything she needs. A woman alone with a man and 2 children, people will talk. You be proper." "Yes, madam," Grayson said with the respect of a man who knew better than to argue. Mrs. Chen sniffed, then softened slightly. "I made stew, enough for 3 days if you are careful. Fresh bread on the table, rooms are all ready." She untied her apron and folded it precisely. "My grandson is waiting to drive me back to town." "You be good," she said to the children, then to Grace. "You be careful." After Mrs. Chen left, Grayson showed Grace to her room. It was at the back of the house, small but well appointed, with a real bed, a wardrobe, a washstand, and even a small desk positioned under the window. The window looked out over the creek and the hills beyond, and Grace could already imagine sitting there in the evenings, reading or preparing lessons. "I hope it is satisfactory," Grayson said from the doorway. He had set her trunks inside but made no move to enter the room, maintaining a respectful distance that Grace appreciated. "It is more than satisfactory, Mr. Anderson. It is lovely. Dinner is at 6. I will leave you to get settled." He hesitated, then added, "I am glad you are here, Miss Lawson. I think this is going to work out well." After he left, Grace sat on the bed and looked around her new home. Through the door, she could hear the children's voices, raised in some argument about chores, and Grayson's deeper tones intervening. It sounded like a family, she thought. A family that was broken and healing, but a family nonetheless. And now she was part of it. That first dinner was slightly awkward, with everyone on their best behavior. The stew was excellent, the bread fresh and warm, and Grace was struck by how Grayson had taught his children proper table manners, despite the rustic setting. Sarah ate with careful precision, answering questions about the ranch with thoughtful detail. Thomas was more exuberant, his stories tumbling over each other until his father gently reminded him to let others speak. "What will we learn first?" Sarah asked as Grace helped clear the dishes, ignoring Grayson's protest that she was a guest and teacher, not a servant. "Well, I thought we might start by seeing what you already know," Grace said. "Tomorrow morning after breakfast, we can sit down together and you can show me your reading and writing. Then we can make a plan from there." "I can write my whole name," Thomas announced proudly, "and I can read some. Sarah can read really well, though. She read a whole book about knights and castles." "That is very impressive," Grace said, smiling at Sarah, who blushed with pleasure. After dinner, Grayson excused himself to check on the evening chores, and Grace found herself alone with the children. She helped Sarah wash the dishes while Thomas dried, and in the comfortable domesticity of the task, some of the earlier stiffness began to ease. "You really not mind being so far from town?" Sarah asked suddenly, her hands stilling in the wash water. Grace considered the question seriously. "I think I might prefer it. Towns can be lonely places even with many people around. Here I have purpose. I have students who want to learn. That matters more to me than being close to shops or society." Sarah looked at her with those solemn gray eyes. "Mama used to say that being out here was better because we were all together." Grace's heart squeezed. "Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman." "She was." Sarah returned to scrubbing a pot with fierce concentration. "I try to remember everything she taught me so I can teach Thomas when he is older." "That is very loving of you, Sarah. But you know, you do not have to carry all of that yourself. Part of why I am here is to help shoulder some of that weight." The girl's eyes glistened with sudden tears, and she blinked them back furiously. "Papa says I take on too much. But someone has to make sure things are done right. And you have done a wonderful job," Grace said gently. "But you are also allowed to still be 9 years old. Let me worry about some of the grown-up things, all right?" Sarah nodded, not quite trusting herself to speak, and Grace squeezed her shoulder in understanding. This child had been forced to grow up too fast, and part of Grace's job would be helping her find the childhood she had sacrificed. That night, Grace lay in her new bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch settling into sleep. The creek murmured outside her window, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. It was different from Philadelphia in every way, but as she drifted toward sleep, Grace realized she felt more at peace than she had in months. The days developed into a rhythm with surprising speed. Grace woke at dawn to find Grayson already up and working, though he always made sure there was fresh coffee and usually something simple for breakfast. The children rose at 7, and lessons began at 8, conducted at the big kitchen table that became their schoolroom. Sarah proved to be every bit as bright as her father had claimed, devouring the books Grace had brought from Philadelphia and begging for more. Grace taught her geography using maps she drew on slate, history through the stories she remembered from her own education. Thomas was more challenging, as Grayson had warned, but Grace discovered that if she made lessons physical, having him measure out mathematics problems with rope, or act out historical events, he engaged with enthusiasm. In the afternoons, Grace expanded their education beyond traditional academics. She taught Sarah more complex sewing stitches and how to plan meals. She let Thomas help her identify plants and insects, turning it into biology lessons. And every Friday afternoon, she read to them both from whatever books Sarah had selected. All three of them curled up in the main room while the Arizona sun slanted through the windows. Grayson was often busy with ranch work, but Grace noticed he made a point of being present for the evening meal and spending time with the children before bed. She also noticed, though she tried not to, the way he looked at her, sometimes quick glances when he thought she was not paying attention, his eyes lingering on her face when she laughed at something Thomas said. 3 weeks into her tenure, a crisis arose. One of the ranch hands, a young man named Pete, was thrown from a horse and broke his arm badly. Grayson had to ride with him to Vulture City to see the doctor, a journey that would take 2 days round trip. "I hate to leave you alone," Grayson said as he prepared to leave, checking his saddlebags for the 3rd time. "But I cannot send Pete alone in this condition, and the other hands need to stay to manage the work." "We will be fine," Grace assured him. "The children and I will continue lessons as usual." "There is a rifle above the door in my room and another in the barn," Grayson said, his face serious. "You know how to shoot." Grace shook her head and Grayson frowned. "When I get back, I am going to teach you. A woman out here needs to know how to protect herself." He hesitated, then added quietly, "I am trusting you with the most important things in my life, Miss Lawson. I need to know you can keep them safe." The weight of that trust settled over Grace like a mantle. "I will guard them with my life if necessary, Mr. Anderson. You have my word." Something in Grayson's expression shifted, softened. He reached out as if to touch her arm, then seemed to think better of it, his hand falling back to his side. "I know you will. I will be back as soon as I can." Grace watched him ride out with Pete, and only when they were out of sight did she allow herself to acknowledge the anxiety fluttering in her chest. She had been at the ranch less than a month, and already the thought of Grayson being gone felt wrong, like something important was missing. That night, Sarah was fretful and Thomas could not settle. They both ended up in the main room with Grace, sitting close to her on the sofa as she read to them by lamplight. When Thomas finally fell asleep against her side, Sarah looked up at Grace with worried eyes. "What if something happens to Papa too?" she whispered. "What if he does not come back?" Grace set the book aside and pulled the girl close. "Your father is very capable, Sarah. He will come back. But Mama was supposed to come back too. She just went to bed with a fever, and then she did not wake up." The raw pain in the child's voice broke Grace's heart. She held Sarah tighter, feeling the small body tremble with suppressed tears. "I cannot promise you that nothing bad will ever happen," Grace said softly. "I wish I could, but life does not work that way. What I can promise is that I am here and I am not going anywhere. Whatever happens, you and Thomas will always have someone who cares for you." Sarah cried then, really cried, probably for the first time since her mother's death. Grace held her through it, stroking her hair and murmuring comfort, and when the storm finally passed, Sarah looked up at her with red-rimmed eyes and something like relief on her face. "I am sorry," the girl whispered. "Never apologize for your feelings," Grace said firmly. "They are yours and they are valid. You have carried so much for so long, Sarah. It is all right to let someone else help carry it now." Grayson returned the next evening, dusty and exhausted but safe. Grace heard the horse in the yard and was at the door before she could think better of it, the children tumbling out past her. She watched Grayson dismount and scoop Thomas up with one arm while Sarah pressed against his side, both children chattering about everything that had happened while he was gone. Over their heads, Grayson's eyes found Grace's, and something passed between them, a recognition, an acknowledgement of something shifting. Grace felt her heart kick hard against her ribs, and she knew in that moment that her feelings for this man had moved far beyond professional respect. As October arrived, the desert began its subtle shift toward autumn. The brutal heat eased, and the mornings carried a hint of coolness that made Grace's daily walks with the children after lessons more pleasant. Grayson was often working nearby during these walks, and he began joining them when he could, pointing out landmarks and sharing stories about the land. One Saturday, he announced they were all going to ride out to check on the northern pastures, and it would be a good opportunity for Grace to learn more about the ranch. The problem was that Grace had never learned to ride. "Never," Thomas was incredulous. "But everyone rides." "Not in Philadelphia," Grace said, trying not to feel embarrassed. "We had carriages and streetcars." "I will teach you," Grayson said, and there was a warmth in his voice that made Grace's cheeks heat. "It is an essential skill out here." So Grace found herself in the corral with a gentle mare named Daisy, Grayson patient and calm beside her as he explained the basics of mounting and sitting. His hands were firm on her waist as he helped her into the saddle, and Grace was acutely aware of every point where his body touched hers. "Relax," Grayson said, looking up at her with a slight smile. "Daisy can feel your tension. She is the gentlest horse we have. She taught both my children to ride." Grace tried to relax, focusing on Grayson's instructions about how to hold the reins, how to use her legs to communicate with the horse. The children watched from the fence, offering encouragement and advice, and gradually Grace began to feel less like she was going to fall and more like she might actually enjoy this. Grayson kept one hand on the bridle, walking beside her as Grace guided Daisy around the corral. After half an hour, he stepped back and let her try on her own. When she made it all the way around without assistance, Thomas cheered and Sarah applauded. "You are a natural," Grayson said, and the pride in his voice made Grace's heart swell. Over the next week, Grace practiced every day, and by the following Saturday, she was confident enough to join the family on their ride to the northern pastures. It was a beautiful journey. The desert spread out in all directions, and Grace felt a freedom she had never experienced in the confines of Philadelphia society. They stopped for lunch beside a small spring, and while the children ran off to explore, Grayson and Grace unpacked the food. In the comfortable silence of two people growing accustomed to each other's presence, they set out bread, cheese, and dried fruit. "You have been good for them," Grayson said suddenly. "Better than I had hoped. Sarah is starting to laugh more, to act like a child again. And Thomas has actually started to enjoy his lessons." "They are wonderful children," Grace said. "You should be very proud." "I am, but I also know their improvement is not due to me. You have brought something to this house that has been missing." He paused, seeming to struggle with his words. "Life, I suppose. Hope." Grace did not know what to say. She busied herself with slicing bread, trying to ignore the way her hands trembled slightly. "Miss Lawson, Grace, may I speak plainly?" The use of her first name made Grace look up. Grayson was watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. Of course. When Margaret died, I thought that part of my life was over. I thought I would raise my children and work the ranch, and that would be enough. I did not expect to feel. He trailed off, seeming to reconsider his words. Feel what? Grace asked quietly. Alive again, Grayson said. I did not expect to look forward to dinner because it meant conversation with someone who challenged my thinking. I did not expect to find myself making excuses to come back to the house during the day just to hear your voice. I did not expect any of this. Grace's heart was pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. I did not expect it either, she admitted. When I answered your advertisement, I was looking for employment. I did not expect to find a home, or to develop feelings that are entirely inappropriate given our arrangement. Grayson moved closer, his gray eyes searching her face. What if our arrangement changed? What do you mean? I mean that I am falling in love with you, Grace Lawson. I know it has only been 6 weeks. I know it is too soon and too fast, and if you need more time, I will wait. But I also know that life is short and uncertain, and when you find something precious, you should not let it slip away out of propriety or caution. Grace felt tears prick her eyes. I am falling in love with you too, she whispered. I have been trying not to. I told myself it was just gratitude or loneliness or the romance of the desert. But it is not. It is you. The way you are with your children, the way you talk about the land, the way you look at me like I am something valuable. Grayson reached out and cupped her face with one calloused hand. You are valuable. You are extraordinary. When he kissed her, it was gentle and careful, as though she were something precious that might break. Grace leaned into it, her hands coming up to rest on his chest where she could feel his heart beating as fast as her own. The world narrowed to just this: the warmth of his mouth, the strength of his arms, the rightness of being held by this man. They broke apart at the sound of the children's voices returning, but not before Grayson pressed one more quick kiss to her forehead and whispered, "We will talk more later." That night, after the children were in bed, Grayson asked Grace to join him on the porch. The October night was clear and cool, the stars brilliant in the absence of city lights. They sat in the 2 chairs Grayson pulled close together, their hands linked in the darkness. I want to court you properly, Grayson said. I know the situation is complicated with you living here, but I want to do this right. You deserve that. How do we court when we live in the same house? Grace asked, amused despite the seriousness of the conversation. Very carefully, Grayson said with a laugh, and probably with a lot of frustration. But I am serious, Grace. I want to marry you eventually if you will have me, but I do not want you to feel pressured because of our living arrangement or the children or anything else. This needs to be your choice, freely made. I appreciate that, Grace said softly, though I will tell you now that my answer when you eventually ask will be yes. Grayson squeezed her hand, even knowing what you would be taking on. A ready-made family, a hard life on a ranch, isolation from the society you were raised in. I would not choose differently. These children need me, yes, but I need them too. And I need you. You make me feel capable and valued in ways I never did back east. There I was just the spinster daughter of a schoolmaster, someone to be pitied. Here I matter. You matter to me more than I can express, Grayson said. He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. I never thought I would feel this way again. Margaret was my whole world, and when she died, I thought that capacity for love died too. But what I feel for you is different, not less but different. Does that make sense? Perfect sense, Grace said. You do not have to forget her or diminish what you had. I would never ask that. You are remarkable, Grayson said, and there was such wonder in his voice that Grace felt tears threaten again. They sat in comfortable silence, hands linked, watching the stars wheel overhead. Grace thought about the path that had brought her here, the grief and loss, the fear and uncertainty, the leap of faith in answering an advertisement from a stranger. It had all led to this moment, this man, this unexpected love. The next few weeks passed in a glow of happiness that Grace tried hard to keep professional around the children. But Sarah, perceptive as always, noticed the change. "Papa smiles more now," she observed one morning during lessons. "He has not smiled this much since before Mama got sick." Grace felt her cheeks warm. "Perhaps he is happy that you and Thomas are doing so well with your studies." Sarah gave her a look that was far too knowing for a 9-year-old. "Perhaps, or perhaps it is because he likes you." "Sarah, I would not mind, you know," Sarah said quickly. "If Papa liked you in that way, Thomas and I have talked about it. We think you would make a good mother." Grace's throat tightened with emotion. "That is very kind of you to say, Sarah. But right now, I am your teacher and that is my focus." "But you like Papa too," Sarah pressed. "I have seen how you look at him." Grace decided honesty was the best approach. "Yes, I do like your father, very much. But these are complicated matters for adults to work through, and we need to do so carefully. What I can promise you is that my affection for him does not change my commitment to you and Thomas. You two will always be my priority." Sarah seemed satisfied with that answer and returned to her mathematics, but Grace noticed the small, pleased smile playing at the corners of the girl's mouth. That evening, Grace relayed the conversation to Grayson during their nightly time on the porch. "They discussed us." Grayson sounded both amused and alarmed, apparently, "and decided I would make a good mother." Grace tried to keep her tone light, but she could not quite hide her emotional reaction to the children's acceptance. Grayson pulled her closer on the porch swing he had installed specifically so they could sit together. "They are not wrong. You are wonderful with them." "I love them," Grace said simply. "I did not expect to become so attached so quickly, but I do. They feel like mine in a way I cannot quite explain." "They are yours," Grayson said. "In every way that matters, they are already yours, just like you are already mine and I am yours." Grace leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart. In Philadelphia, she would have been ruined by now, a woman of marriageable age living unchaperoned with a man, no matter how proper the arrangement. But here, in the wide open spaces of the Arizona territory, different rules applied. People were judged by their character and their actions, not by rigid social conventions. Still, Grace was conscious of maintaining propriety for the children's sake. She and Grayson were careful not to display affection in front of Sarah and Thomas, keeping their stolen kisses and tender moments confined to the privacy of the porch at night or brief encounters when the children were occupied elsewhere. November brought cooler weather and the need to prepare the ranch for winter. Grace helped the children with their lessons in the morning and spent afternoons learning the practical skills of ranch life from Grayson. He taught her to shoot, standing behind her as he showed her how to sight down the rifle barrel, his arms bracketing hers. He taught her the basics of animal husbandry, how to recognize signs of sickness in cattle, how to predict weather by watching the sky. In turn, Grace shared her world with him. She read to him in the evenings, everything from Shakespeare to contemporary novels, and was delighted by his quick mind and thoughtful questions. They debated history and philosophy, and Grace discovered that Grayson's lack of formal education had not prevented him from developing a sharp, analytical intelligence. As the 3-month mark of Grace's employment approached, Grayson became increasingly distracted. Grace noticed him starting conversations and then trailing off, watching her with an expression she could not quite read. Finally, On a cool evening in late November, he asked her to take a walk with him after dinner. They strolled toward the creek, the children visible through the window doing their evening chores under the supervision of one of the ranch hands. The sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of gold and orange, and Grace was struck by how much she had come to love this landscape that had initially seemed so alien. "Grace, I need to ask you something," Grayson said, stopping beside the creek where the water rang clear over smooth stones. "All right," Grace said, her heart beginning to race. 3 months ago, I hired you to teach my children, and you have done that beyond anything I could have hoped. But somewhere along the way, this stopped being just an employment arrangement for me. You have become essential to my life, to my children's lives, to the very functioning of our family." He took both her hands in his. "I know I said I wanted to court you properly, give you time. But I am not a patient man when it comes to things I want, and I want you more than I have wanted anything in a very long time." Grace's breath caught. "What are you saying?" Grayson dropped to one knee, still holding her hands, and Grace felt tears spring to her eyes. "I am saying that I love you, Grace Lawson. I love your kindness and your intelligence. I love the way you have brought laughter back to my house and hope back to my heart. I love how you care for my children as though they were your own. I love everything about you, and I do not want to wait any longer to make this official." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a ring, simple gold with a small diamond that caught the last rays of the setting sun. "Will you marry me? Will you be my wife and a mother to Sarah and Thomas? Will you build a life with me here on this ranch and help me make it a true home?" Grace was crying openly now, tears of joy streaming down her face. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking on the word. "Yes, I will marry you. I love you, Grayson. I love all of you, you and Sarah and Thomas, and this life we are building together." Grayson stood and slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into his arms and kissed her with a passion that made her knees weak. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "I want to marry you as soon as possible," he said. "I know there are arrangements to make, but I have been sleeping down the hall from the woman I love for weeks now, and it is testing every bit of my restraint." Grace laughed, feeling giddy with happiness. "How soon?" "A month. We could have the ceremony here at the ranch, invite the few neighbors and friends we have. Mrs. Chen would be delighted to help prepare. What do you think?" "I think that sounds perfect." They walked back to the house hand in hand, and when they entered, the children looked up from where they were playing checkers. Sarah took one look at their faces and broke into a wide smile. "You asked her," she said to her father. "You knew?" Grace asked, surprised. "Papa asked our permission a week ago," Thomas said, bouncing with excitement. "We said yes, but we had to keep it secret." Grayson scooped his son up and pulled Sarah close with his free arm. "So what do you think? Should we make Miss Lawson part of our family officially?" "Yes." Both children chorused, and then Sarah was hugging Grace, and Thomas was chattering about whether he would have to wear a suit, and everyone was talking over each other in the most wonderful chaos. That night, after the children finally settled into sleep, their excitement barely contained, Grace and Grayson returned to their spot on the porch. Grace admired the ring on her finger, still hardly able to believe this was real. "I never imagined when I answered your advertisement that it would lead to this," she said softly. "Neither did I," Grayson admitted. "I was just looking for someone to teach my children their letters and sums. Instead, I found the woman I want to spend the rest of my life with." "Do you think people will talk about how fast this is happening?" "Probably," Grayson said with a shrug. "But I have learned that life is too short to worry about gossip. Margaret taught me that. She always said the only opinions that mattered were those of the people you loved and respected. Everyone else was just noise." She was wise. She was. and I think she would have liked you." Grayson pulled Grace closer. "I know that might be a strange thing to say, but it is true. She would have appreciated how you care for her children. She would have respected your strength and independence." "I hope so," Grace said. "I want to honor her memory even as I step into this role." "You already do," Grayson assured her. "Every day, in 100 small ways, you honor her by loving the children she loved and helping them grow into the people she wanted them to become." The next month was a whirlwind of preparation. Mrs. Chen did indeed take charge of the wedding preparations with an efficiency that left Grace both grateful and slightly overwhelmed. She helped Grace alter a dress of cream-colored silk that had been her mother's, adding lace and adjusting the fit until it was perfect. She organized the food, enlisted the ranch hands to help clean and decorate, and generally ensured that everything would be ready for the ceremony. Word spread quickly in the small community around Vulture City, and Grace was touched by the kindness of neighbors she had never met. Women appeared at the ranch offering help and advice, bringing small gifts and welcoming her into their circle. The isolation Grace had worried about initially proved to be less absolute than she had feared. The community was spread out but tight-knit, and the arrival of a new bride was cause for celebration. Sarah and Grace spent hours together preparing for the wedding, and in the process, their bond deepened from teacher and student to something closer to mother and daughter. Sarah confided her memories of her mother, and Grace listened without jealousy, understanding that honoring Margaret was part of honoring this family she was joining. Thomas, practical and excited, was more concerned with what his role in the ceremony would be and whether there would be cake. Grace assured him there would be both, and he seemed satisfied. The night before the wedding, Grace lay in bed unable to sleep. Tomorrow, her entire life would change. She would become a wife and mother, tied to this land and these people in ways that went far beyond a job or a contract. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. A soft knock on her door startled her, and she rose to find Sarah standing in the hallway, clutching a small box. "I could not sleep," the girl whispered. "Neither could I," Grace admitted. "Come in." They sat on the bed together, and Sarah handed Grace the box. "This was Mama's. Papa said I could give it to you if I wanted to. It is her handkerchief, the one she carried when she married Papa. I thought maybe you would like to have it tomorrow." Grace opened the box with trembling hands. Inside was a delicate lace handkerchief, yellowed slightly with age but beautifully preserved. Tears filled her eyes as she looked at the precious gift. "Sarah, are you sure? This is your mother's. It should stay yours." "Mama would want you to have it," Sarah said with certainty. "She always said that family was about love, not blood. You love us and we love you, so you are family. That makes you worthy of this." Grace pulled the girl into a tight embrace, overwhelmed by the generosity and wisdom of this child. "Thank you," she whispered. "I will treasure it always." "Will you tell me what she was like?" Grace asked after a moment. "Your mama?" Sarah settled against Grace's side and in the soft lamplight began to share her memories. She spoke of a woman who was kind but firm, who sang while she worked, who taught her children to appreciate the beauty of the desert even when it was harsh. She spoke of her mother's laughter and her strength, her grace under the terrible burden of illness. Grace listened, committing every detail to memory, understanding that these stories were a gift as precious as the handkerchief. When Sarah finally grew sleepy, Grace tucked her into bed and sat beside her until she drifted off, struck by the trust this child had placed in her. The wedding day dawned clear and beautiful, the December morning crisp but not cold. Grace woke to find flowers on her bedside table, desert blooms that Grayson must have gathered before dawn, and a note in his distinctive handwriting. "Today I marry my best friend. I am the luckiest man alive. Mrs. Chen arrived early to help Grace dress, and her efficient hands made short work of the buttons and laces. When Grace finally saw herself in the mirror, she hardly recognized the woman looking back. The cream silk brought out the gold in her hair, which Mrs. Chen had arranged in an elegant style. The lace veil, another loan from a neighbor, softened the whole effect. She looked like a bride, she thought. She looked happy. The ceremony was held in front of the house, under a arbor the ranch hands had constructed and decorated with pine boughs and what winter flowers they could find. A circuit preacher who traveled through the territory had agreed to perform the service, and by 10 in the morning, the small assembly of guests had gathered. Grace stood at the corner of the house with Sarah, who was serving as her attendant, and Thomas, who had insisted on walking her down the aisle since her father could not. As the music began, Mrs. Chen's grandson, playing a fiddle with surprising skill, Grace looked toward the arbor and saw Grayson waiting. He wore a new suit, dark and well-fitted, and his hair had been carefully trimmed. But it was the expression on his face that made Grace's breath catch pure, undisguised love and awe, as though he could not quite believe this was happening. When their eyes met, he smiled, and Grace felt her heart swell until she thought it might burst. Thomas offered his arm with exaggerated formality that made the guests chuckle, and Grace allowed herself to be led forward. As they walked, she noticed the neighbors who had become friends, the ranch hands who had welcomed her, Mrs. Chen dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. But mostly she noticed Grayson, his gaze never leaving her face, his expression saying everything words could not. When they reached the arbor, Thomas very seriously placed Grace's hand in his father's, then stepped back to stand beside his sister. Grayson's fingers closed around Grace's, warm and strong, and she felt a sense of rightness settle over her like a blessing. The preacher began the ceremony, his words washing over Grace in a familiar rhythm. She heard herself make the traditional vows, promising to love and honor in sickness and health for better or worse. When it was Grayson's turn, his voice was strong and clear, no hesitation in his commitment. I take you, Grace, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to love you, protect you, cherish you, and stand beside you through whatever life brings. I promise to be a good husband and to honor the trust you have placed in me. This I vow before God and these witnesses. When the preacher pronounced them married, Grayson cupped Grace's face in his hands and kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. The small crowd cheered, and when they finally broke apart, both were grinning like fools. The celebration that followed was simple but joyful. Mrs. Chen had outdone herself with the food, and someone had brought a small keg of beer. The fiddle player was joined by a man with a guitar, and soon people were dancing on the packed earth in front of the house. Grayson led Grace in a waltz, and she was surprised by his grace. Where did a rancher learn to waltz? She asked, laughing. My mother insisted all her sons learn the basics, Grayson said. She said it would make us civilized, though I think she was optimistic about that. I am glad she taught you, Grace said, allowing herself to be swept along in the dance. As the sun began to set, the guests started to depart, offering congratulations and best wishes. Mrs. Chen was the last to leave, pulling Grace aside before she climbed into her grandson's wagon. You are good woman, she said firmly. You make him happy, make children happy. That is all that matters. Thank you, Grace said, embracing the older woman, for everything. Finally, the family was alone. The children were overtired and overexcited, and it took both Grace and Grayson working together to get them settled. When they finally closed the door to Thomas's room, leaving both children tucked in and almost asleep, they stood in the hallway and looked at each other. Hello, wife, Grayson said softly. "Hello, husband," Grace replied, and felt a thrill run through her at the words. Grayson took her hand and led her to their room, the room that had been his alone, but now belonged to both of them. Someone, probably Mrs. Chen, had placed fresh flowers on the dresser and turned down the bed. A fire crackled in the small fireplace, warming the space against the December chill. Grace felt suddenly nervous, conscious of the intimacy that was about to follow. Grayson seemed to sense her tension because he simply pulled her into his arms and held her, one hand stroking her back in soothing circles. "We have all the time in the world," he murmured against her hair. "There is no rush. I just want to hold you and know that you are truly mine." They stood like that for a long moment, and Grace felt her nervousness ease. This was Grayson, the man she loved, the man who had been patient and kind and understanding. There was nothing to fear here, only love. When they finally pulled apart, Grayson helped her with the buttons down the back of her dress that she could not reach herself. His fingers were gentle, and when the dress finally fell away, he looked at her as though she were something sacred. "You are so beautiful," he whispered, and Grace believed him. They came together with tenderness and passion, learning each other's bodies, taking pleasure in the intimacy they had denied themselves for months. Grayson was gentle and patient, making sure Grace felt safe and cherished. And when they finally lay spent in each other's arms, the fire burning low and the stars visible through the window, Grace felt complete in a way she had never imagined possible. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," Grayson replied, pulling her closer. "Thank you for saying yes. Thank you for taking a chance on me and this life. Thank you for seeing me," Grace said, "for seeing who I really was beneath the desperate woman answering an advertisement." "I think we saved each other," Grayson said quietly. "I was drowning in grief and responsibility, and you were lost and alone. We found each other exactly when we needed to." Grace did not argue because she knew it was true. They had found each other across the miles and the circumstances, two people who needed exactly what the other had to offer. Life on the ranch settled into a new rhythm after the wedding. Grace woke now in Grayson's arms, the warmth of his body beside her a constant source of comfort and joy. The children adapted quickly to calling her Mama Grace, a compromise that honored both her new role and their mother's memory. The lessons continued, but now they were interspersed with the work of running a household, and Grace found she enjoyed the variety. Winter in the Arizona territory was different from Philadelphia winters: less snow, more wind, sharp cold nights but pleasant days. Grace learned to appreciate the austere beauty of the desert in this season, the way the light slanted low and golden, the occasional frost that made everything sparkle like diamonds. As Christmas approached, Grace threw herself into creating traditions for her new family. She taught the children to make paper decorations and helped them create presents for their father. Grayson surprised them all by bringing home a small pine tree, a luxury in the desert, which they decorated with popcorn strings and candles. On Christmas morning, the children woke them early, bouncing with excitement. Grace had made Thomas a new coat and Sarah a beautiful dress, while Grayson had carved Thomas a wooden horse and found Sarah a collection of new books ordered specially from a catalog. But the present that made Grace cry was from the children, a family portrait they had commissioned from a traveling artist who had passed through weeks earlier. The portrait showed all four of them together, Grayson standing behind Grace with his hands on her shoulders, the children on either side. They looked like a family, Grace thought, blinking back tears. They were a family, bound not just by law or proximity but by genuine love and commitment. "You like it, Mama Grace?" Sarah asked anxiously. "I love it," Grace said, pulling both children into a hug. "It is perfect." That night, after the children were in bed, Grayson sat before the fire, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist. "This has been the best Christmas I have had in years," Grayson said quietly. "Thank you for bringing joy back to this house." "Thank you for giving me a home and a family," Grace replied. "A year ago, I was alone and scared and had no idea where my life was going. Now I have everything I never knew I needed." As winter gave way to spring, Grace discovered she was pregnant. The realization came one morning in late February when the nausea that had plagued her for days suddenly made sense. She sat on the edge of the bed, hand pressed to her still flat stomach, overwhelmed by a mixture of joy and terror. When she told Grayson that evening, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. His face lit up with pure delight, and he swept her into his arms, spinning her around before remembering himself and setting her down carefully. "Are you happy?" she asked, needing to hear it. "Happy does not begin to cover it," Grayson said, kneeling before her and pressing his face to her stomach. "Another child, our child. Grace, you have given me so much already, and now this." They told the children together, and Sarah's excitement was immediate and vocal. She had 100 questions about babies and immediately began planning how to help. Thomas was more reserved, asking if the baby would be a boy so he could teach him to ride. "We will love this baby whether it is a boy or a girl," Grace said gently, "just like we love you both equally." As Grace's pregnancy progressed, the whole ranch seemed to come alive with anticipation. Grayson became almost comically protective, insisting she rest more and do less. The children were endlessly fascinated by her changing body, and Grace found herself fielding questions she had never expected to answer. Mrs. Chen arrived one day with another woman, a midwife named Rosa who lived 2 ranches over. Rosa examined Grace with professional efficiency and pronounced everything progressing normally. "First baby?" she asked, and when Grace nodded, she smiled. "You are healthy and strong. You will do fine. I will check on you monthly, and when your time comes, send for me. I have delivered more babies than I can count." The summer heat was oppressive as Grace entered her final months of pregnancy. She moved slowly, her belly large and unwieldy, but she refused to give up her teaching or her role in the household. Sarah and Thomas were patient with her, bringing her water and making sure she rested in the heat of the day. Grayson was devoted, massaging her aching back in the evenings and reading to her when she was too uncomfortable to sleep. He talked to the baby through her belly, telling stories about the ranch and making plans for the future. "Boy or girl, this child is going to be so loved," he said one night, his hand spread across her stomach where the baby kicked energetically. "Just like their siblings," Grace agreed, covering his hand with hers. In late August, Grace's labor began. Grayson sent one of the hands racing for Rosa while he tried to keep calm for Grace's sake. Sarah wanted to stay and help, but Grayson gently but firmly insisted she take Thomas to stay with the foreman and his wife in the bunkhouse. Rosa arrived within 2 hours, calm and capable. She examined Grace, declared that the baby would come before morning, and set about preparing. Grayson stayed at Grace's side, holding her hand through the contractions, wiping her forehead with cool cloths, murmuring encouragement. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Grace was certain she could not continue. But each time she faltered, Grayson was there, his voice steady and strong, reminding her that she was brave and capable and that he loved her. Finally, as the sun rose on August 23, 1879, Grace gave birth to a son. The baby's first cry was strong and healthy, and when Rosa placed the infant on Grace's chest, she looked down at the tiny, perfect face and felt her heart expand in ways she had not known possible. "A boy," Grayson breathed, tears streaming down his face. "We have a son." What should we name him?" Grace asked, exhausted but exhilarated. "I was thinking James," Grayson said. "After your father, James Anderson. What do you think?" Grace's eyes filled with fresh tears. "I think it is perfect." When Sarah and Thomas were finally allowed to meet their new brother, they were awestruck. Sarah held him with careful reverence while Thomas peered at him with fascination. "He is so small," Thomas whispered. "You were this small once," Grace said, smiling. "Can I teach him to ride when he is bigger?" Thomas asked. "When he is much bigger, yes," Grayson said, ruffling his son's hair. Over the next weeks, Grace adjusted to the demands of a newborn while still managing her other responsibilities. It was exhausting but joyful, and she was grateful for the help of her family. Sarah proved to be a natural with her baby brother, able to soothe him when he fussed. Thomas was more interested in the practical aspects, asking endless questions about why babies cried or needed so many diaper changes. Grayson was a devoted father, taking night feedings when he could so Grace could rest. She would wake sometimes to find him standing by the window, the baby cradled against his chest, talking softly about the ranch or the stars or anything else that came to mind. "You are going to spoil him," Grace said one night, watching from the bed. "Probably," Grayson agreed, unrepentant. "But I missed so much of Sarah and Thomas growing up because I was drowning in grief and work. I will not make that mistake with James." As James grew from an infant to a chubby, happy baby, the ranch prospered. Grayson's careful management and hard work paid off in larger herds and better prices. He was able to hire 2 more hands and expand their operations. Grace continued teaching Sarah and Thomas, now adding Thomas's growing interest in the practical aspects of ranching to his more traditional studies. By the time James celebrated his first birthday, Grace was pregnant again. This time, Grayson's excitement was tempered with concern for her health, but Grace assured him she felt strong and well. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and in the spring of 1881, Grace gave birth to a daughter they named Elizabeth, after Grayson's mother. Elizabeth was as different from James as night from day, a quiet, watchful baby where James had been boisterous. Sarah doted on her, thrilled to finally have a sister, and Thomas accepted her with the easy adaptability of a child who had already adjusted to one sibling. The years that followed were full and rich. Grace watched her children grow, each developing their own personality and interests. Sarah, now 14, was becoming a young woman, thoughtful and studious. Thomas, 12, was all energy and enthusiasm, happiest when working with the horses or exploring the desert. James was a sweet, gentle 4-year-old who loved stories and following his father around. And Elizabeth, at 2, was just beginning to talk and walk, keeping everyone on their toes. Grayson had settled into his role as husband and father with a contentment Grace cherished. The shadows of grief that had haunted him when they first met were gone, replaced by laughter and engagement with life. He had expanded the ranch house, adding more rooms as their family grew, and the place that had once felt marked by loss now rang with life and love. One evening in the summer of 1882, Grace stood on the porch watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of rose and gold. 4 years, she thought. 4 years since she had married Grayson, and nearly 5 since she had arrived at this ranch as a nervous teacher hoping for employment. It seemed like both a lifetime and no time at all. Grayson came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and pulling her back against his chest. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "About how different my life is from what I imagined," Grace said, leaning into his embrace. "When I left Philadelphia, I thought I was running away from loss and disappointment. I did not realize I was running toward everything I had been missing." "I know what you mean," Grayson said, resting his chin on top of her head. When I hired you, I thought I was just solving a problem getting my children educated. I never imagined I was inviting in the woman who would make me whole again." From inside the house came the sound of the children arguing about something, Sarah's voice rising above the others as she tried to impose order. Grace smiled, recognizing the pattern. "I should go mediate," she said, but did not move. "In a minute," Grayson said. "Let Sarah handle it. She is good at managing her siblings." They stood together in the fading light, and Grace thought about the journey that had brought them here. The loss and grief that had marked both their pasts, the leap of faith it had taken to trust each other, the slow building of love and family that had transformed them both. "You ever regret it?" Grayson asked suddenly. "Giving up your life back east for this?" Grace turned in his arms to face him. "Never," she said firmly. "That life was not really mine. It was what I thought I was supposed to want. This you, the children, this ranch, this life, this is who I was always meant to be." Grayson kissed her, slow and sweet, and Grace felt the same flutter in her chest she had felt the first time he kissed her 4 years ago. Some things, she thought, never lost their magic. "I love you, Grace Anderson," Grayson said when they finally pulled apart. "I love you too," Grace replied. "More than I can ever adequately express." The sound of breaking glass from inside the house made them both jump, followed by Thomas's voice calling, "It was an accident." Grace and Grayson looked at each other and laughed. "Reality calls," Grace said. "Welcome to our beautiful life," Grayson replied, taking her hand as they went inside together to deal with whatever chaos awaited. The years continued to unfold in a pattern of work and love, challenge and joy. The ranch grew more prosperous, and Grayson was able to hire enough help that he could spend more time with his family. Grace continued teaching, not just her own children but eventually some of the children from neighboring ranches who rode in for lessons several days a week. Sarah grew into a beautiful, intelligent young woman who wanted to go to teachers' college herself. When she was 18, Grayson arranged for her to attend a school in Tucson, and though he missed her terribly, he was proud of her ambition. She returned with a teaching certificate and a young man named David whom she had met at a church social. After a proper courtship, Grayson walked his eldest daughter down the aisle, and Grace cried through the whole ceremony. Thomas had no interest in leaving the ranch. By 16, he was running much of the day-to-day operations, and Grayson began making plans to eventually turn the ranch over to him. Thomas married at 21, a sweet girl named Anna from a neighboring ranch, and they built a house on the far side of the property and started their own family. James proved to have a gift for mechanics and invention, always tinkering with ways to improve ranch operations. When he was 15, he built a better irrigation system that allowed them to expand their crops. Grayson encouraged his interests, and James eventually went to study engineering, returning to apply his knowledge to making the ranch more efficient and modern. Elizabeth was the dreamer, the artist. She filled sketchbooks with drawings of the desert, the animals, her family. Grace nurtured her talent, and Grayson built her a small studio where she could work. When she was older, her paintings began to sell in galleries as far away as San Francisco, bringing her some measure of fame. Through it all, Grace and Grayson's love deepened and matured. They weathered droughts and good years, illnesses and celebrations, the normal challenges of life and parenthood. On their 10th anniversary, Grayson surprised Grace with a trip to San Francisco, their first real vacation since marrying. They stayed in a fine hotel, attended the theater, and walked along the waterfront hand in hand like young lovers. "Worth the wait?" Grayson asked as they watched the sun set over the Pacific. "Everything with you is worth the wait," Grace replied. By their 20th anniversary, They were grandparents several times over, and the ranch house was often filled with the chaos of multiple generations. Grace looked around the table at holiday meals at her children and their spouses, at her grandchildren, at Grayson at the head of the table smiling at the noise and life, and marveled at the family they had built. One evening, as they sat on the porch in the old rocking chairs that had become their traditional spot, Grace reflected on their journey. "You remember that first day at the general store?" she asked Grayson. "Every detail," he said. "You were so nervous, trying to look older and more experienced than you were. I thought you were beautiful and terrifying. Terrifying. You represented change, risk, the possibility of hope after I had convinced myself hope was not possible. That was terrifying." Grace reached over and took his hand, their fingers intertwining with the ease of decades of practice. His hair was mostly gray now, and there were deep lines around his eyes, but to her, he was as handsome as the day they met. "I am glad you took the risk," she said. "So am I. Best decision I ever made, hiring you." "You did not hire me to be your wife, though," Grace teased. "No, but I was smart enough to recognize a good thing when it was right in front of me." Grayson lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it. 3 months. "I only made it 3 months before I knew I had to marry you or lose my mind." "I was not much better," Grace admitted. "I tried to tell myself it was just gratitude or the romance of the desert, but I knew almost from the beginning. You felt like home." "You were home," Grayson said. "You brought home with you and gave it to all of us." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one in the vast Arizona sky. The desert night was alive with the sounds they had learned to love over the years: the distant call of coyotes, the rustle of night creatures, the whisper of wind through the mesquite. Inside the house, they could hear Elizabeth playing the piano Grayson had bought her for her 16th birthday, the music floating out through the open windows. It was a piece by Chopin, melancholy and beautiful, and Grace felt her eyes mist with emotion. "We did all right, did we not?" Grayson asked softly. "We did better than all right," Grace said. "We built something beautiful. A family, a life, a legacy. Our children are good people who know they are loved. Our grandchildren are growing up safe and happy. The ranch is prospering. What more could we ask for?" "Nothing," Grayson said. "Absolutely nothing. I have everything I need right here." As Grace sat there, hand in hand with the man she loved, surrounded by the evidence of the life they had built together, she thought about the frightened young woman who had answered a simple advertisement for a teacher so many years ago. That woman had been seeking escape and employment, never imagining she would find love, purpose, family, and a home in the most unexpected of places. The journey from teacher to wife, from stranger to mother, from lost to found, had transformed her in ways she never could have predicted. The desert that had seemed so alien and harsh had become her beloved home. The children who had needed a teacher had become her own, as precious to her as the babies she had borne. And the man who had hired her had become her everything: partner, lover, friend, the other half of her soul. She thought about Margaret sometimes, the woman whose death had created the space in this family for Grace to fill. She liked to think that Margaret would have approved, that she would have been grateful her children had been loved and cared for, that her husband had found happiness again. Grace had tried her best to honor Margaret's memory while still building her own life with this family, and she hoped she had struck the right balance. "Thank you," Grace said suddenly. Grayson looked at her, surprised. "For what?" "For seeing me. For taking a chance on a desperate young woman with no idea what she was getting into. For loving me. For giving me this life. Grace, you have it backwards. I should be thanking you. You saved me. You saved all of us." "Maybe we saved each other," Grace suggested. echoing words Grayson had spoken on their wedding night so long ago. Maybe we did. The piano music swelled and then faded, and Elizabeth appeared on the porch, her face soft in the lamplight. "I am heading to bed," she said. "Do not stay up too late, you two. Listen to our daughter ordering us around," Grayson said with amusement. "She learned from the best," Grace replied. "Good night, sweetheart." After Elizabeth had gone, Grace and Grayson remained on the porch, neither quite ready to end the evening. These quiet moments together had become precious over the years, stolen time when they could simply be together without the demands of ranch or family. "You ever think about how different things could have been?" Grace asked. "If I had not answered your advertisement, if you had hired someone else, if we had not fallen in love." "Sometimes," Grayson admitted, "and it terrifies me, the thought of living my whole life without ever knowing you without this." He gestured at the house, the ranch, the life they had built. "It makes me believe in fate or providence or whatever you want to call it. We were meant to find each other." "I believe that too," Grace said. "Some things are just meant to be." As the night deepened and the air grew cool, they finally went inside, arms around each other, walking through the house they had filled with love and life. They checked on things out of habit, making sure doors were locked, lamps were out. Everything was in order for the night. In their bedroom, they prepared for bed with the comfortable ease of long familiarity. Grayson helped Grace with the buttons on her dress that her aging fingers found difficult, and she helped him with his collar studs. They had done this dance thousands of times, but it never lost its intimacy, the simple caring of one person helping another. When they finally lay in bed, Grace curled against Grayson's side, her head on his chest where she could hear the steady beat of his heart. This was her favorite place in all the world, she thought. Not any particular geographic location, but right here in this man's arms, safe and loved and home. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," Grayson replied, his arms tightening around her. "Today, tomorrow, and for all the tomorrows we have left." Grace smiled against his chest, content in the knowledge that their love story, which had begun with a simple advertisement and a desperate leap of faith, had blossomed into something beautiful and enduring. From teacher to wife, from 3 months to a lifetime, they had built something that would outlast them both: a family, a legacy, a love that would echo through generations. As sleep claimed her, Grace's last conscious thought was one of profound gratitude. She had come west searching for a new beginning, and had found instead her true beginning, the start of the life she was always meant to live, with the man she was always meant to love, in the place she was always meant to call home. The Arizona stars shone bright over the Anderson ranch that night, as they had for decades, as they would for decades to come. Silent witnesses to the love story that had transformed 4 separate, broken people into one whole, happy family. And if those stars could speak, they would tell of a teacher who became a wife in 3 short months, and of a love that lasted a lifetime and beyond.